Imagine that each morning when you wake up, you're smiling and looking forward to your day, knowing that you're happy even while dealing with grief and loss. The Grief and Happiness podcast inspires, comforts, and supports you with each new episode. For more support, check out the Grief and Happiness Handbook and cards. I welcome you to listen to this podcast and discover endless possibilities for your life. Aloha. I have a very exciting guest for you today, Mark Dowie. He is just a remarkable man. He's done so many interesting things. And today we're going to talk about an amazing book that he, would you say, co-wrote?
No, I wrote it.
You wrote it. Okay. It was really your voice throughout. Let him introduce himself to you.
My name is Mark Dowie, as you know, and I'm an investigative historian by profession. That means that I do revisionist histories using investigative skills that I learned as a journalist, as an investigative reporter, which I've been on and off for the last 50 years. So that's the last 50 years of my life. Before that, I was kind of a drifter. I'm a kind of a cowboy that learned how to write. In terms of background, I have no degrees or never graduated from anywhere. So that's my background.
Oh, that's wonderful. The places you worked fascinate me. But this book is really something else. I'll tell you, you talk about it being a death cafe throughout. And when I first moved to Maui, we came because my husband had lived here a long time before I knew him. And he realized that his days were numbered, and this is where he wanted to be for the end of his life. So we moved here. And after he died, somebody invited me to a death cafe, and I said, "What's that?" But I went, and I loved it. It was so good. There were maybe 8 people there, and it was really good. And I went a few times, and then the guy that was hosting it said that he was just too busy and couldn't do it anymore. So I said, "Well, if you'd like to keep it up, I'd be happy to facilitate because I don't want to lose this." So I have Death Cafe experience too. And of course, your Death Cafe was the smallest one I've ever heard of, but it sounded pretty special. So can you tell us about your book and what we're talking about with the Death Cafe?
Yeah, well, let's stay with that cafe for a minute. Judith and I is the other person in the book. She died in 2019. The whole time we knew each other, the 6 months, very intense, very close friendship for 6 months. The whole time we knew each other, we knew exactly when she was going to die. On the hour, actually, we knew exactly when she was going to die. So that informed everything in our friendship, really. As Judith once said, she was very poetic. She was a poet, published poet. And she once said that, acknowledged that our relationship was defined by her fate, and that the overstory and the undercurrent of our entire friendship was death. And during the time we were together, I suggested at one point that we either join or start a death cafe. She'd never heard of them, and I explained to her what they were. They really have an interesting history, which I'd be happy to share with you if you like. But she said, no. She said, I feel like I have one with you. And so we chuckled frequently for the rest of our friendship about being members of the world's smallest death cafe, hence the subtitle of the book. And it really was, in a way, a sort of free-floating death cafe. We did talk about a lot of other things, and we became close in ways that had nothing to do with death, but it was the defining fact of our lives, really. We read a lot about death. We read a lot of philosophers and spiritual leaders on the subject of death while we were together, and it changed, definitely helped her process the rest of her life, and it changed my view of life and death.
I would think that it would have. After reading the book, I could see you'd have to come out of that changed. Can you tell us what a death cafe is so that our listeners can understand?
Yeah, quick history. Nobody knows exactly when they were started, but it was definitely in this century. I've seen 2 dates, 2011 and 2014. One claims that the first death cafe was in England, and the other says it was in Germany. I don't think that matters too much. What happened was that a group of people got together at tea time, and they always happen at tea time, share tea and cookies and talk about, it's usually 6, 7, 8, well, like your group. That's usually about the max, although I've seen them go up to 10. A group of people that just get together once a week, once a month, whatever the schedule is, and talk about death for an hour or two. It caught on, whether it was Germany or England, doesn't matter. They caught on. And fast forward to today, a mere 10 or so years later, there are 18,000 death cafes in 83 different countries of the world, and they're all linked up. I mean, they're part. There's an organization, a death cafe organization that helps people start and run and participate in death cafes. So it is a movement. It's a global movement that picked up and gained steam very, very fast. And to my mind, now, having been through this experience myself, I'm heartened by it that humans, particularly humans of the Western world, are getting more comfortable facing the inevitable and talking about it with each other. And not just about how you're going to process your remains or your estate or your NDA and all of the things that you have to consider when you're looking at the end of life, but about death itself. What is it? Where are we going? What's happening when we die, et cetera? It's a big topic, and there's a lot of mystery there and a lot of things to talk about. And it's a positive force. I mean, really, I think the fear of death has been defined by most psychiatric therapists and everything as the root of all our psychiatric problems is fear of death. And I'm not sure it's the root of all of them, but it certainly drove mine for a long time. And I think a lot of people that I know.
I really loved doing that Death Cafe. We just got in the most interesting conversations, and I met people I probably never would have otherwise. And it felt good to be free to say whatever you wanted to, because so many people won't talk about death.
Yeah, exactly. And if you do form one, if your viewers and listeners do want to form one, there's endless organizations that will help you do it, that will advise you on how to form it and how to initiate it and how to keep it going and what are the key questions that death cafes should be discussing. The movement is very helpful with other death cafes. So if you do it, plug yourself into the movement and get all the advice you can on how to do it right.
Thank you. I highly recommend that if any of you are thinking about doing that. It's well worth your while. Can you tell us about how you and Judith got together?
We have a mutual friend, another poet friend of Judith's who's known her for years. They were like best friends, really. And I've known her, or the friend. I didn't know Judith before this. Our mutual friend called me one day and told me that Judith was planning to end her life. And her friend wasn't particularly upset about the fact that Judith was going to end her life. It was the way she was going to do it that bothered her. And she called me because I've done a lot of end-of-life counseling. And she called me and said, do you think you could steer her in a more sensible direction? And I said, sure. I agreed with our mutual friend that Judith was not about to do something very wise or useful. And so I said, yes, I can change your mind about how to do it if you want, and I will. And so I called Judith, and Judith said, come on over. We don't live very far apart. I'm out in the West, right on the coast, and she's a little way inland in California in El Cerrito, which is over near Berkeley and Richmond. So I drove over and visited her many, many times after that and steered her away from doing what she was about to do and helped her explore ways that were better for her, better for her family, and better for everyone really involved. And I think it worked out.
What a gift you were to her.
I think she had eventually saw it that way and said so in so many words. Yeah. But we were a gift to each other. I mean, I value that friendship in a way that I valued no other friendships I've ever had. It was very different. I mean, it wasn't a love affair or an intimate, well, it was intimate, but spiritually intimate friendship. But, it was just really, really close. It really got close. And as the end approached, it got closer. It was just amazing friendship.
You mentioned California. Isn't there a medical aid in dying process now?
Yeah, there is. It was signed by the governor in 2015. It's now one of 10 states in the United States that have end-of-life options acts that were basically modeled on the Oregon law, which is the first and is the oldest of the 10. And there's legislation pending in 24 other states right now. I can't predict how they'll do, but it's a hard thing to get through legislatures. But California took 5 tries, and we finally got it. So I think it can be done. And many countries, since Oregon passed their law, many countries, entire nations have legalized end of life assistance from physicians. So it is a global movement. I mean, like Death Cafes, it's a global movement, and it's moving slowly, but I think in the right direction.
I think so too, from just the bits and pieces I've heard. I know we have a law in Hawaii for medical aid in dying. And I actually got to talk to the doctor who's the person who has to bring and prepare the medication to the person that's going to take it and do it right there in front of him. And then the person has to do it totally by themselves. They have to pick up the glass and drink it. And he told me about so many beautiful experiences that people would have all their family and friends around and a huge celebration. And then that would be how the celebration ended that day. And it sounded like a good way to go.
Everybody does it differently. I've been to end of life celebrations of a couple of friends have done it attended to a party, and Judith went alone. She wanted to be alone. She has a child and many friends, including me, but she wanted to be alone. So I mean, it's a personal choice, a personal option. But yeah, under all of the laws that exist so far, you have to administer your own potion and drink it yourself. So, which makes it a little difficult for some people who are really, really seriously disabled or feeble. But you can usually find a way to get a glass to your lips.
Yeah. Wow. So tell us about your relationship with her. How did that evolve?
Well, we got together a lot, but I think most of our communication, actually, if you did it on a word count basis, most of our communication was either email or phone. She's not that close, so and she couldn't drive. So if we were going to get together personally, I had to drive over to El Cerrito, and I did many more times than I would have otherwise. And those were the really close times together when they always are when you're alone in the room with someone. So I would go over there or we'd get on the phone or we exchange email. We're both writers, so writing back and forth is easy for both of us. So that was it. The primary caretaker for her 100-year-old mother, and she had been for 20 years, many years before she decided to check out herself. But one of the reasons, I mean, her primary reason for leaving life was pain. She had a rare neurological condition that gave her not constant, but very acute and chronic pain, which could not be treated. It was intractable. Not all pains can be treated, and she had one that you couldn't treat. So she had pain, but she also did not want to end her life the way her mother. She watched her mother for 20 years. The last 20 years of her mother's life were in bed, lucid but feeble, and she could barely move. And Judith just didn't want to end her life that way. So the combination of pain and watching her mother was very, very slow ending are what motivated Judith to do what she did. I never tried to talk Judith out of doing what she did, although knowing that her mother was 100 years old, I did more than once try to persuade her that maybe she should wait until her mother died, because I just thought that would be just a heartbreaker for a woman to. Judith wasn't her only daughter, but she was her closest daughter. Judith's sister lived in Minnesota, so she was there, and she was her caretaker. And I just thought, why don't you let your mother die first? Judith said, I can't wait. The pain's too bad. So her mother was still alive when Judith died, although I'm not sure she was aware of what was happening.
You mentioned in the book that what she did, it wouldn't be considered suicide. Can you explain that to us?
That was something that Judith and I decided. I mean, we're both wordsmiths, so we spend a lot of time in communications discussing and even laughing about the euphemisms that we all use for painful subjects like death and suicide. And Judith persuaded me early in our relationship that what she was not doing was suicide. She didn't want me to ever describe how she died as suicide, and I haven't. I agree with her. Although, while we were together, one of my children took his life, and that raised the question again, the semantics of the word. Neither of us questioned that his death was a suicide and not a rational suicide. But if you're facing an impossible situation in life, like chronic pain, I mean, watching her have her attacks of pain persuaded me that she had to do what she was doing because it was just horrible to watch. The agony was just so obvious. So escaping pain is different from, or physical pain is different from escaping mental pain or spiritual pain or depression or some of the common reasons for committing suicide. Yeah, we joked about using the word commit with suicide too, as if you were committing a crime to kill yourself, which if you go back into ancient civilizations, it was a crime in some civilizations, but it is no longer. But anyway, so we decided between the two of us that we were never going to regard what she was doing as suicide. I still don't. Voluntarily ending your life is not necessarily suicide. But again, that's maybe we were playing semantic tricks on ourselves and each other and the world by doing that. But it made her so comfortable not being regarded as a suicide that I agreed to that definition and of the word and of what she was doing.
I agree with you. I've often said when people say something about committing suicide, I said it's probably kinder to the people who are left behind if you say died by suicide as opposed to committing suicide, because committing a crime. I've thought about that too, and that we don't call it homicide when we take animals to the vet to be taken care of. We don't say that. So it seems like to me that it should be okay if the circumstances lead to that.
The suicides I know, there's more than one in my family, were desperate people escaping desperate situations that they just couldn't live with, psychologically live with. I mean, Judith had no psychological problems that I could see, but she just had pain. And it was intractable and horrible and agonizing. And as I said, she didn't want to live out her another 20 years like her mother did. So she chose to end her life. I'm sure there are wordsmiths who would say, hey, Mark, get a grip. Suicide is suicide. Well, I don't know. Because Judith asked me not to regard it as suicide, I agreed not to regard it as suicide. And I don't.
I think that's good. Well, I could get into a long philosophical discussion because it seems to me like as human beings, we should have the autonomy to do what we want to with our own lives, whatever that is, and not judge somebody for making a decision different than what we would have made. That's one thing I see. It's people getting angry about somebody committing or not committing, dying by suicide.
Well, a lot of the people that lobby against the kind of laws that we were talking about that allow people to ask a physician to help them end their life, a lot of the people that do that are deeply religious people who believe that that's not our choice. It's only God's choice. And I don't believe that, but I respect it. I respect other people's beliefs. I just don't think that it's fair for Catholic bishops to turn up at legislatures and offer to threaten to excommunicate anyone who considers the bill, or to say that just because the Catholic Church is opposed to suicide doesn't mean that an entire society needs to be against it. Just same with abortion, same with everything that the Catholic Church opposes. It's okay to oppose it for your congregation, but not for the rest of us. So I've always had problems with, although I respect the religious traditions and the religious commitment to doing life a certain way, don't ask me to do it that way.
That's right. What would you say was the most valuable lesson that you learned by being Judith's friend?
Well, the lesson to me is that we have to spend. Now, I'm 85 years old, so obviously I know I'm getting close to the end. But I don't think if I hadn't met Judith, I would have been as ready for the end as I am now. I mean, I think that the lesson that I learned is get ready, psychologically, deeply, spiritually, not get your NDA signed and your last will and testament ready, but get yourself ready, get your soul ready, get your mind ready for the inevitable. And I think a lot of people, death denial is a very, very common problem in all societies, not just ours. I think less so in probably in primitive indigenous societies where they see death around them much more frequently than we do. They don't hide it. They don't cover it up. They don't shroud it the way we do, we being Western people. I think preparing myself with Judith as my guide and my inspiration is what I got out of it. preparing myself for the inevitable. I don't fear it anymore. I don't regret it. I don't deny it. I know it's coming and I'm ready for it. I'm not in a hurry, but I am ready. Thanks to Judith.
It's so important. It's something it behooves us to think about it because it can make life that much more pleasant. One of my husbands, I had two husbands die, and one of them was a bioethicist, and his specialty was in living and dying. And he taught a class that all the nursing students at the college where he taught had to take. And it got to be the point that it was the only class he taught because he was the only one who taught it. And there were all these people that wanted to come beyond the nursing students because they all wanted this opportunity to really examine death and dying. And I took the class from him after we were married. We didn't tell anybody in the class we were married, but I took it because I could get continuing education units for it as a nurse. It was so valuable to me to really look at what living and dying means. And I think most people are just kind of say, I don't want to talk about it when it comes to death and dying issues.
Yeah. Judith described death as her secret teacher. It's constantly with her all the time. Even before she decided to do that, she began seeing death that way as a teacher that taught her more about life than it did about death, as she would say. But interesting you talk about nursing because my stepmother was a nurse on a cancer ward, and she was known on the cancer ward as the death talker because she was the only person on the ward, including the surgeons and other nurses, who was comfortable talking with patients and their families about death. So if somebody brought up the subject to a doctor or another nurse, they'd go grab Barbara, my stepmother, and they'd bring her in and say, they want to talk about death. And Barbara would sit there and talk about death with the patient and their families and pray with them, cry with them, identify with them, and everything she could possibly do. She was really, really good at it. And so that's why they called her the death talker on the ward. And that I've found that that's true in a lot of medical facilities, that there are very, very few people who are really comfortable when a patient says, can I just talk about death for a while? And they say, they get uncomfortable. And they go find someone like Barbara, who's probably taken your ex-husband's course somewhere. But I don't know how she became so comfortable doing that. But I know she was. She and I adored my stepmother. She and I talked about death and dying a lot, too. That was way before I met Judith. She died years ago.
It's so important. At our hospital here, we had a hospital chaplain who visited a patient one day. She was a friend of mine, and they both knew that the end was nearing for him. And she said, was there anything that you didn't get to do or that you'd like to do, or that sort of a conversation? And he said, I'd really like to go to my own celebration. And so she said, okay. And she arranged it. She had everybody come to the hospital. And it was so interesting because he was so close that she arranged it for the very next day. She got all his friends and families. They had balloons and cake and streamers and the whole thing. And they all got to talk to him. They all got to say goodbye. And throughout the time that they were there, he was fading. He wasn't able to continue talking toward the end of it, but he was still smiling. And he died shortly after everybody left. And she just felt so good about it because he just was thrilled to death. And the family was all tickled that they got to come and do something positive with him. I thought that was kind of beautiful. So she arranged for me to come and work with the nurses on the grief and happiness aspect of it. And I did a few meetings with them, and they were so good, and they really liked it. They had a palliative care nurse in charge of it. And she just was thrilled to have me there. And then she got diagnosed with cancer. And the people that took over didn't know anything about what I was doing and weren't interested in hearing about what I was doing. And that kind of faded away. It kind of disappointed me because the nurses always were telling me about the impact that they had from the frank conversations that we were able to have.
Yeah. My friend who decided to take out, he had metastatic prostate cancer and given a short time to live, but he was actually pretty fit and pretty cheerful, but he the pain was getting bad and he knew it was going to be over. So he just called us all one day, and his doctor had given him a morphine drip. One of those things where he says, hit it once if you're uncomfortable, hit it twice if you have pain, hit it 3 times if you're in agony, but don't hit it more than 4 times, right? Or it'll kill you. Well, he just handed him the death machine. And so he had it ready upstairs, and we had a party. We partied for probably 3 or 4 hours, and he was a party animal. He loved to party with his friends. And so we did that, and he just said, okay, it's time. And he went upstairs, and boom, that was it.
Wow. What a way to go. That just sounds so much nicer than other things that I've witnessed. Wow, this is just wonderful. Your book is Judith Letting Go, is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't remember the subtitle. Could you tell us the subtitle?
6 months in the world's smallest death cafe.
Yeah, that's so perfect. I encourage my listeners to find out about death cafes, and whether you yourself are dealing with anything related to death or any of your friends or people are, it's something worth checking out. I know there's some online now that started during the pandemic. So if you're at a place where you don't see one around you, just look it up online and see if you can find one you can visit.
The organizations that help death cafes get started know where all of them are. When I raised it with Judith, who lives in his blue-collar neighborhood, and I looked it up before I did, I found 3 within walking distance of her house.
Wow.
Yeah, and she loves to walk, so it would have been a nice departure for us to walk to a death cafe. But she didn't want to do that. We had what she wanted. 2 people was enough. She did talk about it with her daughter, and she talked about it she had a couple of other friends that she'd spend separate time with, and they would talk about death. But she and I were the cafe.
That's so wonderful. Just a great thing to do. I really appreciate talking to you today about this. And for our listeners, in the show notes, there'll be a way that you can find out more about Mark or be able to get his book, because it's a wonderful read. It was almost like poetry to me. I just loved the flow of it and how it was. And it was very inspiring to me. So I highly recommend it.
Well, Judith was a poet, and I wrote poetry while we were together, and she helped me a lot. She was a teacher. She taught poetry in elementary school and in prisons. So she was a good poetry teacher, and we read each other's poetry a lot, and she was very helpful to me just in the use of language.
Well, thank you so much.
I just say one thing about the book. One thing that, that's my 9th book. And I've been to all through the stuff that you go through with books and doing book readings and all of the promotional stuff that you go to try to. The thing that I noticed about my book when I do book readings is that when people come up with books to sign, nobody has less than 3 books that they want me to sign. Well, I went to one recently in Sacramento, and a woman came up with a bag full of books. I got writer's cramp signing her books. So, oh, this one's for Emily, this one's for Jane, this one's for Jack.
Oh, wow.
And I standing there signing her books. I was, oh, my wrist. Right. But I think gifts are what's driving that book, really. People keep telling me, the minute I read it, I went out and bought 2 or 3 more from my friends and people who have to read it, right? So anyway, those are the reviews I like, the personal reviews.
Oh, yeah, when you can hear from somebody in person.
Yeah, exactly.
I've heard from quite a few people with my book that the same thing. They read it and they ended up buying a few to keep on hand so they'd have them right when they needed it to take to somebody. That it was so much better than flowers because it lasts.
It's such a compliment too, right?
Yeah, it really is.
Work is a gift. Yeah, good.
Yes. Well, thank you. I'm glad you came. I'm so happy I got to talk to you. And so happy I got to read your book. So thank you for that. To my listeners, tune in again next week and I'll have another guest that you won't want to miss. So thank you for listening. Do you want more comfort and support and happiness? Join the Grief and Happiness Alliance at our free gatherings on Zoom every Sunday. Visit my website at griefandhappiness.com and read my books, The Grief and Happiness Handbook, and get your set of the beautiful Grief and Happiness cards. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast, rate it, review it, and binge listen to all of our episodes. I can't wait to welcome you back to another episode of the Grief and Happiness Podcast.